38 jars were found in the Must Farm assemblage, most of which were courseware vessels used for everyday transportation, storage, food preparation, and as cooking vessels. The pottery at Must Farm is divided into living and dead assemblages. So the living assemblage comes from the interior of those structures and would have been in use every day at the time of the fire. So it's the kind of pots that people were cooking with, were eating food from. They're very much active as part of that. But interestingly, around the outsides of those structures, we get these middens, almost like halos of rubbish and waste material. And the pottery that we find in these deposits tend to be broken. They're the kind of the rubbish and the refuse. So when you were going about living your daily life in your house, if you broke one of the fineware bowls you were eating from or one of the courseware storage vessels, those sherds would generally be kind of gathered up and thrown outside of your window effectively, leaving these really distinctive circles around the outsides of those roundhouses. And what's even more helpful to us as archaeologists is that the densities of the material that we're finding in those middens, the volume of pottery suggests that the actual site was very, very short-lived, probably only 6 months to a year after it was built, the fire occurred that effectively brought it to the end of its lifespan.
A lot of the pots at Must Farm are jars, storage jars. They mostly are very thinly formed again, thin walls, with these very thin little rims at the top, and the rims really have the appearance of something that's designed to be able to tie a cloth or a piece of leather over the top. So they really do look like they're intended primarily for storage. They are hand-formed, hand-built, coil-built. I often heard to say that I don't like the term coil-built because it sort of conjures in your mind that thing that you did at primary school of getting little sausages of clay and piling them on top of one another. These are built in a more robust way. And actually looking at this side of the pot, which I've just built and is sort of not yet fully finished, you can actually start to see that there are sections within there. And these are where the coils of clay have been added and pinched upwards. Building a pot of this sort of size in this sort of thin wall quality, there's about 2 hours work in this so far in actually building that pot, 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So it's not a huge investment of time, and it ends up with something which will function. But quite a few of the pots, they're pushing that bit further and they are finishing them nicely. And I think the sort of prime difference between the courseware pots and the fineware pots is really in terms of time and effort put into it. Courseware pots often will be made from coarser clay. That gives you advantages in the firing, it gives you advantages in the building, it makes a pot that's easier to build, makes a pot that's easier to fire. But even with quite a coarse clay, you can still work it down to a fine finish. And this one, as I say, this side, I've just left it as it is. But if I swing it round, this side, I'm starting to refine it. And that's the sort of effect that you get if you start to refine the surface. And by refining the surface, I simply mean working over with a tool like a piece of bone or a piece of horn and scraping over the surface to build it up and to finish it off. This has not yet been burnished or anything like that, just smoothed out.
The fourth largest jar at Must Farm has a slight burr on its underside. The fact that this had not been chipped off or become worn implies that the pot was either relatively new when the settlement burnt down or was otherwise moved infrequently during its use life. The jar weighs 4 kilograms when empty, making the latter seem likely, and serves as a reminder that some vessels were more akin to storage fixtures within buildings than others used and moved in the daily preparation of meals. As people would have used the pots at Must Farm, we know that they would have become broken. In the same way today that we drop a plate or we break a bowl, exactly the same thing was going on during the Bronze Age. And archaeologists really like to discuss this idea of breakage history. So how often were the pots that were in use in the Bronze Age broken? And there's a lot of kind of discussion based largely on sort of ethnographic studies of people who use pots in different societies. But it's a really interesting question that we don't really have a very good answer to. But it's usually thought that pots were fairly long-lived, maybe even lasting for several years before they were broken. But the volume of pottery that we have at Must Farm, a site that we know was probably only active for 6 to 12 months, really makes us think about that process, because the volume of broken vessels that we're finding would suggest that people were breaking a pot probably once a week living in this settlement. So this idea that people are breaking but also making pots on a fairly regular basis helps us have a kind of a different perspective on the people who are living there and how they might have viewed and used the material. Despite the large proportion of broken pots at Must Farm, 5 of the courseware vessels in the assemblage had post-firing perforations, interpreted as repair holes. The vessels range in size, with no evidence that particular categories of pot were more worthy of effort to mend than others, which suggests that the jars had a broadly similar value and were seemingly salvaged wherever possible.
Okay, so I've said that it takes a couple of hours to make this, so not a huge investment in time. But of course, having made it, you've then got to dry it, you've also got to fire it, and the larger the pot is, the more difficult the firing will be. Larger pots are going to it may be possible that some smaller pots could be fired in the hearth inside a structure, inside a hut, but bigger pots almost certainly not. They're going to have to be fired in some structure, some fire, some hearth outside of the settlement. So you've got the making of it, the drying of it, shifting of it to a firing site. You've got fuel that you've got to collect. You're going to fire this pot, and there is a risk within the firing of it. So all of these are added sort of problems. So if you've got a pot which is cracked or a piece has been broken off it, if you're using this pot for just storing dry goods, you could actually repair the pot. How are you going to repair it? Well, a lot of these pots will be repaired by simply drilling through and using something like rawhide to pull the pot together. And that's probably going to take you half an hour to an hour to repair a pot. So you've got an economy in time, but you've got an economy of risk. You're pushing that pot to be longer lived and a greater lifespan for the pot, and with less risk and effort, you've still got a perfectly functional pot.
The vessels that were found at Must Farm show a range in quality, suggesting some might have been made by less experienced potters. 15 of the vessels from Must Farm were decorated. 12 of those were courseware storage jars, 2 of them were bowls, and 1 of them was a really beautiful poppy-headed cup. And that is reflecting a trend that can be seen across the wider assemblage itself, that there isn't a huge amount of decoration at any of the artefacts that we find from Must Farm, and what decoration there is tends to be very simple and quite simplistic. One of the cruder pots has a rim that's been unevenly slashed with a narrow-edged tool. Unusually, along some sections of the rim, they are overlain by fingernail impressions at right angles to the tool marks, creating a series of crosses. So a lot of the decoration on the ceramic vessels tends to be fairly simple lines, often very well executed, particularly in the case of things like the poppy-headed cup. But what that suggests to us is that that kind of decoration wasn't particularly important to the people that were living there. Interestingly, there was a choice of finish for a lot of the vessels that we find, particularly the fineware bowls, many of which were burnished. So 39% of vessels found at Must Farm were burnished, whereas only 4% of sherds were decorated with incised lines or finger marks. And that's a curious component of a wider aspect of the Bronze Age, that some artefacts were decorated, but often to fairly simple degrees. And it's one of the eternal mysteries, really, of prehistory as to why certain objects seem to have been given more attention and why others were much more functional, seemingly, or were perfectly acceptable to be quite simple.